Welcome everyone to our next ICODR member meeting. Delighted to be here today with our good friend and founding ICODR board member, Dan Rainey, to talk about his new book. So Dan, thank you so much for joining us, and really excited to tell everybody about your new book. So thank you for joining us this morning.
Yeah, pleasure to be here. I'm looking forward to this.
Yeah, and we want to make this as participatory as possible. So please don't hesitate to interrupt. I got a ton of things that I can ask Dan, but you were just saying we got a lot of graybeards on the call. So I see a couple graybeards. Stan's got a gray mustache, so I think that counts.
Absolutely. That's a great mustache, by the way.
All right, so let's dive right in. What's the title of the book? Who's the intended audience? Who were you picturing while you wrote it? And how's it roughly laid out?
Yeah, well, it's we went round and round about the title a little bit. It's basically, the title is Integrating Technology into Your Dispute Resolution Practice. And the subtitle is Making Friends with the Fourth Party. And I wanted to make that the main title, but the publisher kept saying nobody will know what that means. And so so we shifted it around. And frankly, the reason I did it, there's a ton of stuff out there that's been written about online dispute resolution, and it's all good. If I had to pick, obviously my favorite so far, obviously would be the book that Ethan was part of editing and writing, and that's the Theory and Practice book, because it gathers just about anybody. It's a who's who of people who have written about online dispute resolution gathered together in one book. But the issue with that book and with all the other stuff that's out there, as good as it is, and Colin, you've written a couple of really good things as well, is that they tend to focus on what I've called the wholesale approach to online dispute resolution. That is e-commerce and the justice system, where you have millions of cases and they're bounded in a universe that in the e-commerce world, there are only a few things that can go wrong and only a few things you can do about it. And in the e-justice world, they're bounded by the law, essentially. And there are people like me who don't live in either of those worlds. Basically, I do a private practice that is, I call it a retail practice as opposed to a wholesale practice. Not millions of cases, a few cases, cases that are a little messier than you would find in an e-commerce environment. And basically what I'm trying to do, and what the people that I've worked with are trying to do, is say, okay, if we've got this technology now that we're going to use, how do we take that technology and adapt it into this traditional practice? I mean, so what difference does it make? How do I avoid the things that are problems and make up for things that are deficiencies? But how do I exploit those things that are advantages that we didn't have when we didn't use technology? So the target audience was basically essentially a private practitioner's audience, and it's, as much as anything, it's a how-to book. Basically, I've been doing this for a long time, and I've probably made every mistake you can make, and I've tried to take that experience and say, okay, if I were going to do this right and do it the best I could and make it the best experience that I could for the parties who come in, what would that mean? How would I do that? So, that's why I wrote it, and that's basically who it's aimed at. There are a couple of chapters in the beginning that are more general, that have to do with communication theory and with a little bit of neuroscience, but those are very, very direct and very short, but they really sort of set the stage for, okay, this is what do I do to get ready? What do I do during? What do I do after? Absolutely. That kind of thing.
Yeah, and the practical aspect of the book, I think, is incredible. I mean, the appendices have actual documents and forms you can use in actually providing ODR services. I think my favorite chapter is the ODR and practice chapter, which we're going to get into, which has, I love all the footsteps, and it's so focused around practice. But I know you divided it into several sections. You talk about ODR and communication, you talk about ODR and the brain, you talk about ODR and culture, ODR and ethics, and then the last section on ODR and practice. So why did you structure it that way?
Well, I guess the basic answer would be that we do the things that we do as third parties for a reason, and they work for a reason. And I'm sort of making an assumption here. I shouldn't say we. I say I very often. I'll put it that way. Go through the process and go through the motions of doing third party work. Because I've learned to do that. They've worked for me before, and they almost become part of my consciousness. They're part of the way I approach the parties. But if you get behind that, for me, there's a reason that we do the things that we do. They work for reasons. And so what I wanted to do with the communication chapter and with the neuroscience chapter and also with the ethics chapter is say, okay, when we take that fourth party, when we take the technology and we integrate it into our practice, it actually does change some things. And we may be doing more or less the same thing that we did before when we were doing it all face to face, but there are some differences, and there are some things that you ought to be, cognizant of as you begin to work with parties. And so I start out with basically a review of an essentially basic communication model and say, okay, what difference does it make that we're now adding technology to the mix? And then talk about how you adapt to that. And with the neuroscience, basically one of the things that I've come to believe in my own practice is that there are some very basic things that I want to do for the parties to make them more comfortable in their conflict situation. Most people want to feel that they're safe, that they have an environment where there's safety and security. Most people want to feel that there's an order, that we're not in chaos all the time, that there is actually some structure and some order to what we're doing. And most people, I would say everybody, wants to feel that their self-worth is being upheld, that they're being treated with respect. And there are ways that you can use technology to bolster all three of those feelings, all three of those elements of this virtual space that you create. And it's a little bit different from working face-to-face, and it takes a little more effort than working face-to-face. And what I've tried to do is say, okay, if these are the things that we're trying to do with and for our parties, how do we do that in the best way possible? How do we set ourselves up for success in the best way that we can?
Absolutely. And I think one of the most lasting criticisms of ODR that seems to have legs is the Gene Sternlight, Robert Conlon criticism of ODR, that somehow the use of technology in the dispute resolution process, it doesn't respect the full complexity of the psychological journey that people go through in the resolution process. And I feel like by starting with your discussion of communications channels and talking about the neuroscience undergirding this, I feel like this is the most eloquent response the field has ever made to some of those criticisms because they've largely gone unanswered. I think there are important things for us to consider from a systems design perspective, but it creates a great foundation for you to build your arguments about ethics and culture on top of.
Yeah, it's, I won't go so far as to say those criticisms are bunk, because I think in some circumstances they actually have some merit.
Right.
But I think one of the things that I have come to believe as a result of the work that I've done over the last X number of years is that there are some social and psychological advantages one can build into a technology-assisted process. And I think for me, and one of the things that I argue in the book is that preparation is the key, preparing yourself, preparing the technology, and then preparing your parties. Because what we're basically doing when we work as third-party practitioners is we're building a virtual space for people to come into. And if I invite you into a conference room in a traditional face-to-face environment, it may be a fraught environment, and there may be some things we have to iron out, but I don't have to teach you how to talk. I don't have to teach you how to pass paper across the table. The essential nature of that environment is one that we basically understand. But when I create a virtual space that I invite you into, I do in some senses have to teach you how to talk in that space. I have to teach you how to share in that space. And that process of being able to build that space with the parties, I find to be a tremendous asset.
I agree.
So what I basically do, and what I argue for in the book, if you have the opportunity to do it, is to use the learning process about the technology as the first thing that you do with the parties together that is successful. And so you don't talk about the issue, you don't talk about the fight that they're having. You make the technology almost the common enemy, and we're trying to figure out, how do we do this? I invite you into this space. How do we use this space? And if we can do that together, what I've generally found is, first of all, there's probably a couple of light moments there where we mess it up and we have to go back and correct it and get it right. And what that does is begin to build a relationship that is not there when I simply invite you into my conference room and we start cold with your issues. And so I think there are some things that are different, and things that potentially actually assist one in building that social relationship.
Yeah, you know, the ICODR standards call for sort of a pre-mediation technology assessment check-in, you know, where you can just make sure that people's cameras. And I've heard a lot of mediators say to me, I love that call because it's an
Mhm.
opportunity for us to sort of establish some norms. I want to talk about your great chapter on ODR and culture too, but I love the way that you define culture as sort of the way we do things around here. And I think that that's what you're saying. It's like we're going to sort of set some norms together. And I think technology gives you an opportunity to kind of say, okay, this is kind of how this works. And oftentimes face-to-face doesn't offer that because it's like, well, you know, face-to-face always has the same basic structure, whereas technology, there are decisions we have to make together. So,
Yeah, the other thing is that uh, you know, we don't always use the same technology, but we tend to, again, I'm using the word we, maybe everybody else doesn't feel this way, but there's a tendency in my mind anyway to assume that because we've been doing Zoom now for through the pandemic, and because everybody's online and everybody uses technology to some degree or another, that everybody's going to be comfortable and we're going to immediately dive into this situation and everybody's going to be able to use everything and everything's going to be comfortable. That's basically not the case. Even people who are relatively tech savvy really get something from, not just technically, but also socially, from saying, okay, in our session, when we get together and we're working on your problem, we're going to have to do A, B, C, and D. Let's make sure we can do those things so that we don't have to think about them when we're dealing with your issue. We know how to do those things and we know that they work.
right.
And that begins to create that feeling of a safe environment, an environment where there's some order, and where I'm saying to them, okay, I care that you feel uncomfortable. Let's make you comfortable.
Absolutely.
Let's deal with you in that basis.
Well, that's a great segue into, I think there's so much news that you make in this book because there's many contributions that I think all of us are going to want to chew over in the field. But one of the things that we've been talking a lot about recently is what is ODR, you know, and obviously we had the definition that, you know, three of us were very involved in creating ODR as just ADR plus technology. But that's, you know, I think all agree that that's a little bit too broad. It's not that helpful anymore. Now we have the National Center for State Courts definition, which you share, and the ABA definition. Obviously, Leah and Chris made big news in Dublin because they came up with a much more sophisticated and nuanced definition of ODR. But you define it in your book as, quote, the use of ICT applications and platforms to fulfill any of the core functions of our work as third parties. So tell us how you got to that definition and what's inside of it and what's outside of it.
Well, one thing that has been sort of it's the, I don't know, the cutting edge, the fulcrum, the break point, whatever you want to call it, in definitions, has been how much is online and how much is offline. Are you doing, as the National State Courts folks, do you go into a system and you stay in it all the way through? And I guess in my practice and the people that I worked with, what I've seen is it's far more common for people who are traditional third-party practitioners to integrate pieces of technology into their practice and not to do the entire practice online. And I know when I was with the National Mediation Board, I mean, basically we use technology a lot, but the essence of our work was that we would use the technology to frame the face-to-face work and to do work after the face-to-face work, and to take some of the pressure off of the face-to-face work. And so for me, the idea of what is ODR, it exists in a very broad tent. And, you know, I have a definition of the fourth party also that I think is fairly broad. And I was quite pleased actually when Ethan looked at an early version of the draft and said, well, I think you basically got it right when you talk.
Well, let me share that definition too, because I think this is big news because we've never really defined the fourth party before. So you define the fourth party as, quote, the let's see, the use of ICT applications and platforms to fulfill any of the core functions of our work as third parties. Which,
no, it's basically the example that I use that the first one that ever came across my attention was.
I'm sorry, I got that wrong. Let me correct myself. The fourth party is the use of ICT that adjusts or changes the basic interaction among parties and third parties. Okay.
Yeah, and well, they're related. The idea that both of those are related. That the thing that first struck me about this is that When I began to use a desktop computer, not on the internet, not connected to anything, but when I started to use a desktop computer to draft documents, to save documents that we created during the work that we did, to save my notes, it changes what I can tell the parties about confidentiality. It changes what I can tell them about the way we work. It's a very, very small example, but what it said to me was that you don't have to engage in a cradle to grave online process in order for the technology to make a difference in the work that you do. And so for me, I want to back away from the notion that we have to be all online and it has to involve artificial intelligence or augmented intelligence. For me, when you begin to integrate technology into your practice, you are changing your practice. You are changing the relationship that you have with the parties that you're dealing with the information that the parties give you, and with the technology itself. And I think if you don't acknowledge that and keep that in mind when you're talking about the ethics of our profession, I think you're making a big mistake. And so, yes, it is true. I probably have the broadest definition of ODR and the broadest definition of the fourth party that's out there. And I do that because of the experience that I've had with the difficulty in my own mind of narrowing that definition in the practice that I have.
Sure.
Not that it doesn't fit for other people, but for me, it's restrictive to talk about ODR and the fourth party in those sort of, I don't know what you would call it, the cradle to grave terms, put it that way.
Well, it's interesting because I think we did center just on alternative dispute resolution, traditional dispute resolution in our initial definition of online dispute resolution. And I feel like you're centering third parties in the definition of the fourth party in a similar way, because that's something we understand what the role of third party is. So that helps us understand what the role of the fourth party is.
Yeah, that's fair. Yeah.
Yeah. I do want Ethan, I don't mean to put you on the spot, but I know you had a chance to look at Dan's definition of the fourth party as well. And I just wanted to hear what are your thoughts about the use of ICT that adjusts or changes the basic interaction among parties and third parties?
I think it's worth remembering fourth party was an idea that surfaced to me in 2001. So 20 years ago, what technology was there 20 years ago? So that's why I think what Dan is talking about is consistent with what I had in mind, but even though what he's referring to is much more robust technology than we had in 2000. But my idea in 2000 was, here's this technology. It's going to assist all parties, assist the third party, and therefore the fourth party. It was, a rather simple idea, really. The metaphor, and the metaphor, I'll just say this, the metaphor was buried for 15, 18, 19 years, and all of a sudden has surfaced again in various places. So a lot of gratitude on my part for that, but the original idea was rather simple. Technology can help. What technology that might be? Well, I didn't really know at that point because there wasn't much. There was communication. I think that was the other core principle, which Dan described very clearly. Dispute resolution is a communications process. It's amazing to me still that going back 20 years, which means that the ADR movement was 20 or so years old.
Right.
But still, there wasn't general acceptance of general understanding of the idea that dispute resolution is a communications process. And the lawyers didn't understand that the law is a communications process. And all I said was, we have these technologies that are communications technologies. They've got to have an impact. So I think I didn't describe what that impact necessarily was. I think Dan has.
Well, I think about Neil Stephenson coining the term metaverse, in Snow Crash in the early 90s. I don't think he knew that Minecraft and Fortnite, were going to emerge. But, Ethan and Janet writing about the fourth party, prior to Facebook, prior to everything that we've seen, one day when we have, digital judges deciding our Supreme Court cases, you should take credit, Ethan. You invented that long ago. I want to open this up in a minute because we have so many great minds on the call. I think, Dan, I do want to talk on your practice chapter. I think it's so practical and useful. It's really accessible in how it lays out each step. And I also love the questions that you ask. I think that's the questions in the book almost are more valuable in a sense than all of the appendices listing all the standards, because I feel like it's the beginning almost of of an assessment instrument, to evaluate whether or not, how are we doing as practitioners? If we can ask these questions and then find the answers, we have a pretty good idea about whether or not we're within the guardrails, of the ethical standards of ICODR, things like that. So talk about your ambition for that practice chapter and how you'd like to see it used moving forward.
Well, there are actually, I think, a couple of things that I would say about that are at the core of what I was thinking about. And one has to do with ethics. And that is, how do we actually do things with our clients, with the parties that are defensible in an ethical environment? One of the things that I think is true, and one of the things I didn't talk about as much as I probably should have in the book, is the fact that most private practitioners, most of the retail practitioners like me, are still using a sort of a patchwork quilt of technology. It's mostly communication technology, but it also is technology that helps you evaluate information and some other things. But as we go through the next few years, we're going to see more and more of what I call bespoke programs, like the ones that you deal with, Colin, that are going to be available to private practitioners that basically in one bundle have everything that you need in order to go from cradle to grave. And even if you're not doing it online, but the process will take you all the way through. And I think the other thing that's going to happen is we're going to see more and more augmented intelligence and maybe eventually artificial intelligence in tools that are available to private practitioners. And I find that a little bit troubling because I don't think we're cognizant yet of how big an impact that is going to have on the practice of dispute resolution. I just the other day, I heard Samuel Alito make the comment, I want to get his quote correct, is that computers have no intent, which is bullshit on the face of it. Computers do have intent because we build the intent into them. And if we don't deal with an ethical framework that not just for practitioners, but for designers and for providers, we don't build in some ethical frameworks that are going to make sure that we are treating the information and the people that we deal with as fairly as we have been able to do it in a face-to-face environment, then we're going to be at the mercy of the technology. And I don't think that's a very good thing. And so that's one of the things that I was trying to sort of indicate in the work that I've done is always think about the impact of this. What are those things that we say that we do for the parties, that we say that we don't do to the parties, and make sure that as we use technology, we're not changing that relationship in a way that is detrimental to the parties. So the ethics part of it was a huge thing. The other thing is just practical steps. I do think it
literally
is
with the footsteps. Yeah, in the chapter.
I think it is. There are many ways to approach third-party work, and as I think I say somewhere in the book, that everybody's going to sooner or later work out their own approach. But there are some things that I think work reasonably well and that are sort of common sense things. And just as one example, I make a big deal out of doing a risk damage assessment as you're choosing technology. I sort of try to break it down into how do you prepare yourself, how do you prepare the tech, and how do you prepare the parties? And part of preparing the tech is to figure out what is the level of risk that I'm offering the parties when I use this technology. If the information we're dealing with, if they don't care if it winds up on the front page of the Washington Post tomorrow, then I don't have to worry too much about the technology. But if it's information that might harm them in some way, if there's damage that's going to be done, if that information is inappropriately handled, then I'd better think very clearly about the kind of technology I'm using And it's probably a good idea for me in my practice to have more than one kind of technology to do the same job with more and less security. Because as everybody knows who uses technology, when you add security, you add complexity, which adds the difficulty in using the technology. Sometimes you just have to do that, and sometimes you don't have to do that. So the whole idea of my footsteps was, let's take it a step at a time, and let's consider those things in each step, which is going to get us to the next step in a way that is consistent with our ethical approach to working with the parties themselves.
Well, I want to say also, you and Leah did such great work on revising the ICODR standards to integrate information about AI and machine learning and all the impact that's going to have. Actually, Jeffrey and I had a call just a little while ago. He's a new friend of mine from IU. And I was talking about how everyone's talking about machine learning, artificial intelligence, but 99.5% of the ODR programs around the world are not yet leveraging those elements. But I think we can all agree they're going to play a greater and greater role as we move forward. Yeah. So it was funny, you talked about Alito, saying that technology essentially has no agenda, but it makes me think of McLuhan, the medium is the message. And when you create new tools and new forms of communication, people respond to the dynamics that those channels enable. And we can see, how online communication has changed the dynamics between people, and many would argue it's coarsened our national debate. It's not that the technology has an agenda, but it certainly has transformed the communication that takes place through it. So
Colin, that idea goes all the way back. I mean, McLuhan, I won't say that he ripped off the idea, but McLuhan was basically saying in a different way what Claude Shannon said back in the late 40s and early 50s.
Right. Yeah.
That, the way you do the message, the thing that sends the message, the system that sends the message has an impact. It's part of the communication itself.
That's right.
So that's, I would call him almost the father of digital communication. And if he's thinking about that in the very beginning, we really ought to be thinking about it now as we move more and more toward augmented intelligence and other kinds of very sophisticated communication channels that are going to be used in the work that we do. Well,
and that's one of my favorite quotes from Bob Taylor, is one of the inventors of ARPANET, that undergirded the internet. He said, a lot of people talk about the algorithmic power of computers, but what really interests me is the computer's ability to mediate human-to-human communication. Like, that's the real transformational power. So, I think that's fascinating. All right, well, look, I want to open it up here. I was very selfish, and I took the first 30 minutes to ask you all the questions, but we have so many great people on the call here, and I want to hear what everybody has to say. I am one of the few lucky, I know Leah's read the book and Ethan's read the book, but one of the things that's been a hot debate, and I think in some respects it's interesting because it's such a simple question, but we've gone back and forth on this, is Zoom ODR? And I think it'd be interesting to evaluate that question in light of your new definitions. Is Zoom ODR, and is Zoom the fourth party, if it does affect the dynamics between the parties and the third parties? So I'm not going to ask you to answer that. Why don't I open it up first, now that we're 30 minutes in, and see, Leah, I would love to hear your thoughts as well. You wrote a beautiful preface to the book, and I think you called out why this is such a landmark achievement in the field. Maybe you could share some thoughts to kicking off our wider discussion here.
Happy to. Thanks, Colin. Congratulations, Dan. I put it in the forward, but I'm happy to say it now publicly in front of a live audience, that I think it's an enormous contribution to the field. It not only sums up where things are at, but it provides those footsteps and vision for us to think about both concepts for us to harness, but also questions for us to consider, because in our practice, we are making decisions all the time during every step of the way, but also practical guides for next steps. So I just think it's enormous contribution. And I guess a couple thoughts that I have are that technology really is this tremendous disruptor, both in everything that you've shared so far, Colin and Dan, about communication and relationships between the parties, but it makes me think about how the fourth party both creates a new geography, a new terrain, a new space in which we're communicating. it's also tools that we use to assess data and communicate data. And so it feels more complex in many ways. And we're both online in this space together, but we're also living our real physical lives. And so it disrupts boundaries in this incredibly exciting and sometimes negative way. And Dan, I was thinking about how your practical suggestions about preparation give us an opportunity to rethink these things, even when we're not using technology. So I know your book doesn't focus on that, but I see it as an invitation and a challenge to the field. If we need to be thinking about how communication occurs differently or people have different access when we're using technology, some of those questions are not effectively yet addressed after 40 years of ADR in our field. So we kind of have a general assumption in the field that if we're all speaking English, we all have equal access to participate, just as an example. And so I think your steps are incredibly helpful for people who are harnessing technology or using technology as a space to gather. But I also think they could be useful for us when we're not using technology. And so going back to the idea, Colin referenced this, a kind of continuum. The National Center put out a white paper that folks, if you haven't seen it, you're welcome to look at under odr.info publications, where we're giving a bit of a continuum for the debate about what is ODR, and Dan's framing is really covers the entire continuum. But for those spots when we're not using technology as part of our practice, I think that the questions you raise and the suggestions about preparation are useful for face-to-face engagement as well. So I think the contribution is bigger than just for the ODR aspects. So I hope that adds to the conversation as you all contribute with your ideas about Dan's book and what he's offering. And again, I just compliment you and thank you for the contribution.
Thank you, Leah. Anybody have a question? I'm more than happy to talk.
Bob, please.
Okay, Dan, thanks for the contribution. I haven't read the book yet since I just found out about it today, so probably go get it. What I'm wondering about is calling technology a fourth party, does it actually slow down the integration into the process rather than in terms of its actual benefit? Because, for instance, telemedicine is kind of the online, what they call their online medicine approach. Corporations have been using this for years. People with cell phones, teenagers gather in crowds, and they text each other when they're trying to make a decision together. And I think that essentially is about virtual presence. And I think looking at what we've been doing so far in dispute resolution, we're really talking more about virtual presence and the adoption of virtual presence into the process, as opposed to just pure technology. And I guess the original question is, does it really help by isolating it, or is there another approach we can look at?
Yeah, I appreciate the question. I don't think my attitude was to isolate technology. I use the fourth party language because it is, my assumption is that to a lot of people who've dealt with ODR, they're familiar with the term and they understand it on some level. What I really am talking about is, what are the things that influence the way we deal with one another in a dispute resolution environment? And it's obvious that the character and the behavior of the third party influences that interaction. It's obvious that the perceptual filters and the behaviors of the parties influence that interaction. I think when we begin to use technology of any kind, whether it's technology that simply allows us to talk when we can't get together, whether it's technology that allows us to gather and evaluate information, whatever that technology does, it has an influence on the way we deal with one another. We talk to each other, we deal with each other in a way that is different than if we had to sit in a conference room and do that all using paper and face-to-face interaction. So whether you call it the fourth party or whatever you call it, what I was really interested in is what is the influence that the use of those tools, and I would go back to what Ethan said a moment ago, dispute resolution at its base is a communicative enterprise. That what we're trying to do is get people to talk when they can't talk to each other very well, and to use their communication abilities to either totally understand why they don't agree with one another, which is one thing that happens, or that they use their communication abilities to find a way to mesh their desires and their positions into something that they can walk away with and feel happy about. And what we do to influence that and to affect that process, that communicative process, it seems to me is important. And so fourth party, whatever you want to call it, doesn't matter to me what you call it, but it is influential. And telepresence is not the same as being, I have been using technology to deal with one of my doctors for the last 5 years over some fairly complicated stuff. And while I enjoy doing that, it ain't the same as sitting in her office and talking to her face to face. It's not the same as going into the physical location. And so the question is, so what? What's the effect? What's the impact? There is one. And if we ask a question about it and try to understand it, then I think we deal with it better and maybe make that experience better for the people who are involved. That may be a around the barn way of responding to your question, but that to me, the idea of influence is key. It changes when you use the technology in the communication that we have with each other as third parties and parties. It changes that interaction, and we should understand that change and either exploit the thing that's good that we can get out of it, or at least mute the disadvantages that it may bring as well.
Yeah, I think that's a good answer. I bring it up only because, I've been using technology since the late 60s. So I had my first email account in 1970 on a teletype machine, right? And so what I'm wondering about is we've integrated technology, communication technology in this case, into corporations, into fields of medicine, engineering, and all these other places, and we haven't actually taken it out and said, okay, this is a separate thing to deal with. Let's look at its influence on the whole process in general. And so far, it's been integrated into all those activities. And I was just wondering again, is there a real need to isolate it and look at its absolute effect on each process we do? And does this apply to all the other fields that we're in? Or is it just something particular with dispute resolution?
Yeah, well, you beat me. The first use of technology that I had with dispute resolution was back in the 80s when I worked with some clients to do a mediation using telephones and fax machines between Europe, North Africa, and the U.S. So you've been there before I was. I guess one of the things that I have observed in my own behavior, put it that way, is that as I began to integrate technology into the work that I was doing, and again, the work that I was doing was retail dispute resolution. I was working with a relatively small number of parties on relatively complex issues. I wasn't thinking very much in the beginning about how much the technology was affecting or impacting what I was doing. So if I'm using Zoom, or if I'm using WebEx, or back in the day when I was using a dedicated web video or online video system that meant that I had to travel to a place where it was hooked up by a wire with some other place, I was still talking to you. And so my initial sort of foray into this was, okay, it's not that different. I'm still talking to you. We're still using language. We're still seeing each other to some degree. But what I've come to believe is that there's a very profound influence, and one that I can exploit, and one that I have to deal with. And so I think for dispute resolution, because it is essentially at the base an exercise in human communication, then the use of the technology does affect that human communication, does affect that process. I think it's worth talking about as a separate factor, as something that that is essential to talk about. Now, whether that carries over into, like I have friends who are architects who use technology to do architectural design. Whether it affects them in the same way, I couldn't say. But I know for me, because I'm using it to talk to another human being about a problem that they have, I think the use of that technology is influential. It does have an impact. And I think it is worth talking about as a separate item, as something that you sort of try to understand in and of itself.
You know, there's a word that Bob said that really resonated with me, and I want to think about it more. We've talked a long time about how technology is making more fluid the concepts of identity and concepts of place and concepts of time. But the word that Bob used is presence. And I'm doing a lot more presentations on the metaverse. And I think it's a very interesting thing to say, you know, when you have a dispute resolution process, you want your other party to be present. And in face-to-face, we know what that means. But now I think it's a kind of again, a fluid concept, this notion of presence. But this is something I'd like for us to think about what that means in the ODR. So I appreciate you saying that, Bob.
Yeah, I would also note, Colin, that one of the things that Ethan and Leah were involved in research for the National Science Foundation back in the early 2000s, in the mid 2000s. And one of the questions that we asked in the work that we were doing very early on was to the parties, did you feel heard? It may not be a great term to use, but did you feel heard online in the same way that you felt heard as a party? Did your information come across? Do you feel that you were respected and were you heard in the online environment? And the answer that we got back was yes, they did. And it was interesting to figure out how they felt about that. But that idea of presence, you know, am I really fully there when I'm not really there? And so how do you manage that? And I think your comment about the metaverse is right on money. The things that we have to deal with now are so much more influential and significant than they were 25 years ago, that and they're getting more and more sophisticated every day, and they're getting more and more influential every day. So if we think about the idea of augmented reality or AI of any kind coming in and being an integral part of dispute resolution discussions and disputes and processes, then that influence is going to go up. It has to go up.
Absolutely. I just want to.
By the way, let me say,
yeah.
To buy this book,
Yeah.
just to do my little commercial, I'll post some things in a moment. There are three ways that you can get this book. One, it's being published by 11, which is a Dutch publishing company. And if you wanted to buy it, if you're in Europe or some other part of the world where you want to use euros or you want to be shipped from Europe, you can go to that link that I'll give you in a moment. And it's available either as an ebook or as a hard copy book to ship from Europe. In the US, the distributor is IPG, International Publishing Group. They are having a problem with their site. You go into an endless loop when you try to put your credit card in, and they've promised me that they would have it fixed by today. They didn't, but hopefully they'll have it fixed within the next day or two. And then Amazon shows that it's out of stock, but that's not really true. You can order it on Amazon and it comes through IPG. They order it through IPG. So I'll put in a moment in the chat room all of those links to all of those places. And although I'm very unhappy about the fact that they're having trouble, hopefully they'll have it fixed within the next day or two.
Dan will also
Dan,
send you
if you need some
PDF.
help, I think you've got a lot of people here who could assist with some online dispute resolution.
I've just ordered the book off UK Amazon. It's not available on the US Amazon, as you said, but it is available on amazon.co.uk.
Good. Yeah,
I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, I think what's happened, actually, I'm not making excuses for them because I'm really frustrated by it, but I think they've changed their interface recently, and they just didn't quite get it right when they handed off the book to the distributors. So I apologize for that.
Well, I was going to say, as an old school software pirate, Dan, information wants to be free. So maybe if somebody PayPal's you $50, you can PDF them a copy of the proof. I don't know. I'm not sure how 11 would feel about that, but
Yeah,
Colin,
I'm not sure I care.
Colin,
So.
please.
Yeah, sorry, I'm looking forward to reading the book, and you may indeed answer this question, but without us all becoming, and I know some of you already are, kind of technology experts, how do we, and we assume technology is disruptive, how do we actually weigh the impact influence of technology in ODR. You know, I know it's a huge question, but I'm just wondering from a practical point of view, since your book is focused on practical, how do we do that? I mean, in person, neutrality, impartiality, and we could argue over those words too, but we have those. But how do we determine, how do we use the good parts and not use the bad parts? And how do we make it as impartial and neutral if we're going to take the same terminology forward?
Yeah. One of the things that I say when I teach classes in this, when I work with parties in this, one of the first things I say is forget the technology on the front end. Just forget it altogether. Ask yourself, what is it that you do? What are the things that you have to accomplish in the work that you do? What are the functions that are key to your practice? And those are going to be answered differently by people who are in different kinds of practice. You know, what are the things that you have to accomplish? And when you have that map of the functions that you have to fulfill with your parties, that's the point that you go back and say, okay, is there technology that helps me do those functions? Do I have a choice about what I use? So if the function is I need to gather information from the parties on the front end, I have to do intake. Is there technology that will help me do intake? You know, if I have to at the back end, if I need to do joint text editing and do e-signatures, is there technology that helps me do that? And so what I argue is you think about the things that you do, think about your practice, and then try to think about technology that you think would be useful and appropriate for you to use in the practice that you have. I also suggest that you think about more than one way to do the function. And so, for example, again, just pulling things out of the air, if you're involved with parties and you think that email is too dangerous to use because it's too easy to make mistakes with, then maybe you use a fully, a more safe version, like a proton mail or something like that, where you have encryption in a different way and where the information is stored in a different place. And so what I try to suggest is don't think about the entire universe of technology as being available to you. Think first what you have to do, and then go find the technology that will help you do that in a way that is useful for you. And then learn how to use it very well so that you don't have to think about it as you're working with your parties. What I suggest is, you know, when you identify a piece of technology that's going to be helpful, you know, prevail upon your friends and your family to do dummy sessions with you so that everything you're going to have to do with your parties, you do over and over and over again with somebody at no risk. So that when I'm with you as a party, I don't have to think about the technology very much. I can pay attention to you. I also suggest using co-mediators and having a tech person work with you. But you know, so getting away from your question here, but essentially what I suggest is don't worry about the technology itself. Worry about what you need to do and find a way to use technology to do that in a way that fits with your practice. And you'll find some people will find there's not much that I do that I want to use technology for. You'll find some people who will say almost everything I do I could use technology for. But it's a matter of how your practice operates and what you do and the kind of people that you work with. And so don't let the technology drive you. You drive the use of the technology. Don't let the technology drive your use. And again, maybe that didn't answer your question. I'm sort of beating around the bush here a little bit, but.
Well, I think it's a huge answer to go into, but that was a great answer. And it kind of makes me feel a bit better that I haven't been totally messing everything up by not paying as much attention as maybe I should have to the technology. Thanks.
Sure. I want to note also, Myron, come to you in 1 minute, but Colum's got an amazing ODR book that's also going to be available. So keep an eye out for that. We're going to have you to do an ICODR session soon too to talk about
thanks.
that. Yeah. Meyer, please.
Yes, I'd like to toot some horns here about our organization and its wisdom. The Los Angeles Superior Court is the largest integrated court in the world. There are 80,000 cases filed roughly a year in this system. So you can imagine the processes. For about 20 years, the court had an ADR program offering mediators, newborn mediators for free, experienced mediators for a low cost of $150 an hour. The cost of administration of that program got so high that when the budget cut came, they cut out the entire system. They were 10,000 cases a year that were passing through that program, and they dropped it. Okay, so they just didn't have the budget for it. I was on the executive committee, so I knew the program, I knew all the forms, I knew what was required. I applied for, in 2018, the court in its wisdom decided to outsource mediation. And we applied and got a contract for 5 years to do outsourced in-person mediation using lawyer mediators only. The court's requirement of the contract, we could only use lawyers with 10 years of good standing in the state bar. So I went out and discovered a number of great lawyers who are transitioning to mediation. And today we have 20 outstanding lawyer mediators with more than 20 to 30, 40 years of experience. In 2018, the court in its wisdom asked for contracts for ODR. It so happens at the same time I started using Zoom. And I approached the court with the fact that we could use Zoom for mediation online. And they granted me a 5-year contract. So we have been operating under 2 contracts with the court since 2018. But as you all know, when COVID hit, all in-person mediations stopped. And we were one of the few organizations ready to do online mediations because we adopted ODR in 2018. And I did this because my own experience was that I had a case in which the lawyer was in San Diego, about a 2-hour drive from here. Her client was in New York, a collection agency. And the defendant was in Los Angeles and his attorney was in Newport Beach. If they had to come for an in-person mediation, it would have cost thousands of dollars and loss of time. I invited them to use Zoom. We went on Zoom. We finished the mediation in 3 hours. And I've got a report from the attorneys that said, this is the way of the future. This is 2018. So when 2020 comes along and it's now COVID time, we're basically one of the major organizations that provide online dispute resolution. And the fact is with regard to your technology points, and I'm looking forward to reading the book because we're deeply into technology and operating everything we do. Everything now is automated. We have a system of client management that is completely automated now using Zoho that was customized for our needs. So we're able to handle hundreds of mediations. And what's interesting in being the catbird seat that I'm in is that I get to see how these cases get administered and how they get assigned to clients. And then we have a client survey to find out what they think about how the experience was. So we have a rich database and we're required to report to the court the outcomes of our mediations. And we've done hundreds of them with great settlement rates. And the fact is that without the ODR, our mediators who are experienced lawyers could not have developed a practice without it. And they all are thankful for the fact that ODR was available so that they could continue to mediate cases without a pause. In fact, one of our top mediators is a graduate of Harvard Law and Stanford and so forth. He's been a 40-year practitioner. He's our most active one. He moved to Albuquerque. So he's not even in Los Angeles to do any mediations. It's all online, and he's done 20, 30 mediations this past year at our low-cost mediation. So what we've offered to the public is a low cost. It's $150 an hour for the first 3 hours with a qualified attorney.
Meyer, I'm going to cut you off just because time's getting short here.
Sure.
You know, I think it's amazing what you've achieved with the program, and I think it's a testament to the transformative power of some of these technologies. I think it does kind of take us back to that little softball question I put out there, which is Zoom ODR? I mean, I think your case management is another aspect of it that goes beyond just simple Zoom. But Dan, what do you want to react to some of the things that Meyer shared?
Well, sure, I'd be happy to. You know, it's very impressive what you've done, and I applaud you for it. It reminds me of a quote from a colleague of mine that I've been working with throughout the pandemic. But I guess at the end of 2020 or not, yeah, in 2020 sometime, we were talking about all this, and she said, you know, the COVID situation has made us all learn to use technology in our work. Hopefully in the next year or two, we can all learn to use it well, which is not to say that you haven't been using it well, but there's one of the things that sort of caused me to write this book is that, you know, I know that in my own experience, I started out using the technology and I found out along the way by making some mistakes that there are some ways to do it and there's some ways not to do it. And what I tried to do with the book was pass along some of the caveats and some of the experience that I got from sticking my fingers in the fan every now and then and not doing it right. And I want to make very clear, Meyer, that I'm not saying anything about the quality of the work that you guys do. What I'm saying is that when people walk into using technology, there's this comfort level that sometimes is uncalled for. That a little bit of discomfort, a little bit of questioning of the way you're doing things is not a bad idea, not a bad thing.
Well, and to paraphrase Ethan, the power of technology to resolve disputes is dwarfed by the power of technology to seriously mess things up. So,
Yeah. Eileen, I see you have your hand
yeah,
up.
Eileen, please.
Well, thank you so much, Daniel. I'm writing my PhD now on the emerging conflict resolution entrepreneurs, people that run their own business and what makes them successful. So I'm curious if you see like the fourth party is a necessary skill for emerging practitioners. It's one of those, it's not, it is necessary to learn and master this skill. And then also maybe if you can talk about future trends where the fourth party helps people, maybe expand their portfolio of work, to earn more, revenues because of the fourth party. So it's really helped them to have a more successful practice.
Yeah, well, a couple of things. The second one first, and that is, yeah, I mean, for example, I've been doing work internationally and work that I don't have to travel for, thankfully. And that is work that I wouldn't have done without the technology. I just wouldn't have had the capacity to do it as a private practitioner. And so I do think there was at one time a fear that the technology coming in was going to open things up and automate things so that lawyers and dispute resolution folks were going to lose business. I've always thought that if you handle it right, if you learn what you're doing with the technology, you're going to increase your opportunity to do work, not decrease your opportunity to do work. And so I think that's from my point of view, that's just an axiomatic statement. There's a lot of stuff you can do out there if you can bring people into a technology environment who couldn't get into a face-to-face environment. It just makes sense to me. And the other part of it about training, it is my opinion that every training program for dispute resolution professionals ought to include a separate segment on the ethics of and the practice of using technology. And if you didn't do anything else, talk about how you choose it and what the risks are when you use it, and talk about how you draw people in an appropriate way ethically, deal with them. And so I think I think it ought to be required in any dispute resolution. Certainly any certification program that's out there ought to be dealing with online dispute resolution as part of their certification training.
Well, Dan, I want to respect your time. Thank you so much for this conversation today. I'm going to
Sure, by the way, Colin,
Yeah,
I hate to,
please.
don't mean to interrupt, but I did put in the chat room the links to 11 IPG and Amazon. And I crossed my fingers and hope that I didn't give you bogus links, and they'll be working in the next day or two.
Well, if you're okay with that, I'm actually going to send out that link, that information you put in the chat. I'm going to send it out to all the ICODR members.
Yeah, that's fine.
So I'll do that right after this call. And the other thing I'll say is this conversation, we're just beginning. We have so much more to talk about in the book. And the good news is you're doing the keynote of Cyber Week, which is coming up in just about a month. So we can dive deeper into all of these topics. But I just want to thank you for taking the time today to now launch this with all of us at ICODR, and the time you took to write the book. And I think this is as they say, a rock in the pond. I don't think the field will ever be the same after this contribution. So thank you so much for that.
Well, thank you, Colin, for having me. I appreciate the opportunity to interact with everyone.
All right. And with that, thank you everyone for dialing in. Please be well. And please, first week of November is going to be ADR Cyber Week.
Cyber Week.
It's going to be amazing. It's an incredible, incredible panel, our best ever. So please make sure to carve out some time in your schedule. So thank you, everyone. Be well.
Wow.
All right. And we'll see you soon.